Afternoon
Hello.
to this highly relevant discussion sponsored by the Center for Global Justice, How the West Was Stolen, in which Joe Belden will discuss the U.S. Mexican War of 1846 through 48 and other ramifications. The Center for Global Justice has presented thought provoking programs for over 20 years here in San Miguel de Allende. In the big world out there, your online tax deductible donations keep us going. And live audience members, as some already have, will find the basket today for offerings here in the room. Online anytime, the place to visit is www.globaljusticecenter.org. Click the red Valentine on the homepage and you can donate. Other information on the website includes an archive of past presentations and details on trips that we offer. As we know, Mexico lost over half its territory to the United States. The factors that brought on the war include not only Texas settlement and annexation, but slavery, racism, the Democratic and Whig parties, and the Manifest Destiny doctrine that still hangs over us today. The key figures have changed, but in both countries, but we'll see how this war connects to U.S. militarism in 2025. Joe Belden is a Washington, D.C. based writer and lecturer. He's taught courses and lectured at the American University's OLLI program, the Biblioteca Pública, and Instituto Allende in San Miguel de Allende, and other venues. From 1989 to 2015, he was Deputy Executive Director of the Housing Assistance Council in Washington, D.C., a national nonprofit. He also worked at USDA on Capitol Hill and for several DC-based think tanks. His writings cover contemporary topics in the rural U.S., affordable housing in U.S. politics, and other related things. He's a graduate of the University of Texas, Austin, and the Baylor University Law School. Today's presentation will be followed by questions from the live and online Zoom audiences, and will be viewed later on YouTube, accessible from our website, again, globaljusticecenter.org. So let's get it started by welcoming Joe Belden.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm going to try to do my share screen here on my PowerPoint. Hope this is going to work. Share. Yep. Everybody see that? Looks good. Okay. Well, again, thanks for joining. If you're old enough, you probably can tell how this title occurred to me, How the West Was Stolen. Those of us that are older will remember the movie of the 1960s and the related television show of the 1970s called How the West Was Won, which is sort of related to this topic. I think a lot of scholars and activists, and I would certainly agree, would interpret the settlement of the continental United States as really largely an act of theft from Native American tribes, indigenous tribes, and also from Mexico, is what we're going to talk about today. And of course, the idea or the occurrence of a stronger country taking territory from a weaker country is not something that originated in the 19th century. It's been around for many years. It's going on today, but that's what we're going to focus on. So again, I will try to go here for 30, 45 minutes, and we'll hope to save plenty of time for discussion. So this, whoops, where are we? No, it's not. This is a little girl singing Texas, Our Texas. I'm going to skip over that. I grew up in Texas, and what I always ask people in the United States when I teach this course is, how many of you know your state song? And almost nobody does. They aren't even aware if they have a state song. But in Texas, those of you who are from Texas will remember it is drilled into you from a very, very early age. So I'll come back to this. It's a little girl about 7 years old singing Texas, Our Texas. But just some of the second and third verses there And we start this whole discussion with what went on in Texas in the 1820s and 30s. But notice there are some of the things that I have underlined from tyrant grip now free, mother of heroes. Well, the tyrant apparently was Mexico. Um, Mother of Heroes, well, that maybe refers to the Alamo, so we'll get to that. Glorious Alamo talks about emblem of freedom. Anyway, we'll come back to the little girl at the end if we have time. Um, the Yeah, I think it's really important to understand the history of Texas. Some of you may be from Texas and may know some of this. Um, the story is really starting here in 1821. Um, Mexico at that time, I think most of you will know, has achieved its independence from Spain. It's become a new country, after an 11-year-old struggle starting in 1810. Um, I don't think I need to tell this audience, but when I do this talk in the United States, I often say to people in the class, I hope you'll come away with two items or two facts about Mexico. One is Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. Um, that, as I'm sure most of or all of you know, is September 16th, 1810, when Father Hidalgo issued his cry and the Mexican Revolution started against Spain. The other thing I tell them is, I hope people will realize Mexican is not a race. Mexican is a nationality. Hispanic is not a race. Hispanic is an ethnicity. And Mexico has many racial mixes. There are Afro-Mexicans. Anyway, people are often surprised to hear that. The revolt against Mexico, it says, is successful in 1821. We're going to go through what happened in the 1820s and 30s. The Republic of Texas lasted for 9 years after the Texians and some Tejanos broke away from Mexico. Um, then there was gradually this movement for annexation of the Republic of Texas into the U.S. as a state. That finally happened in 1845. James K. Polk became president of the U.S. in the election of 1844. And I'll talk more about that. And he was really the driving force behind the war, and we'll see that. Texas became a state at the very end of 1845. And then the sparking kind of event was a conflict between Mexico and the U.S. over what the southern border of Texas was and the southern border of the U.S. You'll see here in this map, if this is pretty visible, the yellow, well, this is what the Republic of Texas looked like in those 9 years, 1836 to 45. But the yellow portion was the Republic of Texas. The larger green portion out there was always disputed between Mexico and the Republic of Texas. But they developed this argument over what is the southern border. And of course, today it's the Rio Grande River. At that time, Texas in the U.S., the Republic of Texas in the U.S. would claim the Rio Grande River. Mexico would say, no, it's further north, the Nueces River. So that became the difficult question. Just a little aside about Six Flags. Some of you may have gone to Six Flags amusement parks in the United States. They're spread all around. They started actually in 1962 near Dallas. I grew up in Dallas. I remember my high school class went there for one of our graduation trips. But Texas is very proud of existed within these 6 different countries, one of which was actually the Confederacy. But if you look at the Six Flags amusement park now, they call that the Old South rather than the Confederacy, sort of sanitize it a bit. Confederacy may be coming back, of course. But okay. You may have heard of Stephen F. Austin, particularly if you're from Texas. His father was named Moses Austin. Moses Austin died, and his son Stephen took over the idea of contracting with the new Mexican government in the 1820s to bring families into Texas to help settle it. Um, Spain earlier, and certainly Mexico starting in the 1820s, wanted to try to provide more settlement of its northern provinces. Texas and California, particularly Alta California, Upper California, were very sparsely settled, and also New Mexico. New Mexico, actually around Santa Fe, in the early 19th century, had more settlement of Europeans than California and Texas did. But the Mexican government wanted to try to promote this settlement of Texas around San Antonio and other places. They particularly were interested in trying to create a buffer zone um, between the European and Anglo settlers and the Tejanos and the Apaches and Comanches who were further west in Texas. So Stephen F. Austin, first his father, then Stephen F. Austin, were the most successful of these impresarios that contracted with the new Mexican government to bring families to Texas. Um, and he had brought 300 families and their slaves. Remember that they're enslaved people to Texas. The Anglos in the South, particularly interested in coming to Texas to practice slavery-based cotton agriculture. What the Mexican government wanted them to do is to settle further west to provide this buffer zone. But what the Anglos, particularly cotton growers from Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, had worn out their land, were looking for new land, and were also looking to expand further west. And this was part of a general trend going on in the U.S. in the first half of the 19th century of the slave states in the South wanted to expand into new slave production territory further west. Anyway, Stephen F. Austin died shortly after Texas became an independent republic. But this is, you can all read this. He is saying in a letter here in 1831 that his only object of settling Texas was to redeem it for the wilderness and settle it with an intelligent and enterprising people. And apparently he must mean that the Mexicans who were already there, not to mention the native people that had been there for hundreds or thousands of years, were not intelligent and enterprising. So we'll see more of this kind of opinion as we go along. So just briefly, you probably know some of this. Tejas and Coahuila were combined together as two sparsely settled, Mexican provinces. The first civilian Spanish settlers came to San Antonio to join the priests and the military that were already there in 1731. The Anglo settlements, as I was saying, picked up in the 1820s and 30s. There were other impresarios also bringing Anglo families in to settle. Gradually, the slave-owning growers who had settled in the eastern areas with good soil for growing cotton became more and more discontented with and resistant to the Mexican government, particularly over taxation, but also over slavery. Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829 and also tried to cut off the further immigration of Anglos from the U.S. coming into Texas. That was pretty much ignored, though. They kept coming. It led eventually to this conflict with Mexico and the so-called Texas Revolution against Mexico. So we'll get into a little more of that. Davy Crockett. I don't know about you, but my Cub Scout den in the 1850s had Davy Crockett themed meetings most of the time. I have a woman who co-teach in DC with she's a retired Foreign Service officer, and she's about my age. Also, and she recalls that when she was a little girl in the 50s, she had a coonskin cap also. She didn't have one of the little rifles. I think my Cub Scout buddies, they had little rifles. Davy Crockett was a very interesting character. He was from Tennessee. He served in the Congress. Um, he was defeated for re-election in the Congress in 1834, so he left Congress in 1835. Um, left for Texas, and he famously said after he was defeated for re-election, I think he had written something that was published addressed to his constituents who had defeated him, and he said, "You can all go to hell, and I will go to Texas," which is what he did. He arrived at the Alamo just about a month before the Alamo fell. Interestingly, he was a protege of Andrew Jackson, um, uh, president of the U.S., and also from Tennessee, and two others, as we will see. James K. Polk, later president, was also a younger Tennessee politician, and Sam Houston, later the president of the Republic of Texas, was also from Tennessee. So three younger Tennessee proteges of Andrew Jackson. This, of course, is Disney's Davy Crockett with Fess Parker. You probably remember this at the time. That was what leading to all of the craze of that time. The John Wayne movie about the Alamo, of course. Anyway, the Texas Revolution, again, was sort of led up to the U.S.-Mexican War, beginning in 1835 with the first hostilities in the Alamo, March the 6th. The Goliad Massacre, just a few weeks later, may know about that. The Santa Anna directed that 300 plus Texians who had surrendered be killed. They were all executed. Then just a few weeks later at the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texians, and assisted by some Tejanos, won that battle. Surprise attack on the Mexican army. Santa Anna was captured. And to save himself, he agreed to let Texas break away from Mexico and secure its independence with these two separate treaties in the middle of May. This is a well-known picture of Texas that hangs in the Texas state capitol. This is Santa Anna there in the blue jacket and the white pants, and Houston had been wounded in the leg. He's lying by the tree. And then this is all the victorious Texian army. Santa Anna was lucky he wasn't executed, but anyway, so Texas is broken free. The Republic of Texas then, as you may know, a lot of people I talked to about this in Washington, D.C. are not really familiar with that familiar with this history. The Republic of Texas, though, existed for 9 years. It was never recognized by Mexico. In fact, Mexico several times tried to invade, coming back up across the Rio Grande and trying to re-seize Texas. So there was this ongoing conflict. The Texians, the Republic of Texas managed to fight them off. But it really was a nation built on cotton and slavery. And a lot of scholars would say it really was a blueprint for the Confederacy, 1861 to 65. And it was really, in some ways, a more successful slavery-based republic than the Confederacy was, certainly. But this is what, again, this is a contemporary map. And you can see Arkansas and Louisiana and Mississippi to the right. You can see the Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma, of course. They're above the Republic of Texas. But the Republic of Texas was relatively small compared to the state of Texas today. And I think he showed this map to most people in the United States today and asked, what is this? They would not recognize that as the Republic of Texas. And frankly, I did not myself until a few years ago when I started studying more about this. But so interesting language here in the Constitution of the Republic of Texas and the state. And it says here, the Congress of the Republic shall not have any power to emancipate slaves, nor shall any slaveholder be allowed to emancipate his or her slaves without the consent of Congress, the Congress of the Republic of Texas. So that seems to imply that any 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 owner of a person who might want to emancipate one enslaved person would have to get a bill passed by the Texas Congress. I don't think this was ever tested. I don't think it was ever used. And it also says no free person of African descent shall be permitted to reside permanently in the republic without the consent of Congress. You have to get a bill for that also. So then a few years later, Texas has become a state. And an article in that constitution says the legislature does not have any power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves without consent of their owners. So does that imply that every uh, owner of enslaved people would have to consent to any law like that? Anyway, again, these are just things that are on the books. I don't think they were ever tested, and the Republic of Texas really didn't last that long. And the state of Texas, as a slave owning power, did not last more than 20 years. Anyway, so let me say, if any of you are interested in more about the war, I would highly recommend this book. It's called A Wicked War. I think it's showing up. It's by a professor of history at Penn State named Amy Greenberg. She was actually speaking a year or two ago in San Miguel, using the title of her book here, A Wicked War, at the Lifelong Learning Program at the Allende. Her subtitle is Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico. And her title, I'll talk a little bit more about this. Her title actually comes from the memoirs or a journalistic interview late in his life of Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general and president of the U.S., as a very young officer in the Army, just out of West Point, a couple of years. He was actually in the Mexican War, and he later said, as we'll see in a quote later on here, I've never heard of a more wicked war. So a very interesting kind of thing. But the other thing I would say is, if you're interested in the Alamo, you may know this book. I think they're showing up backward here, but Forget the Alamo. I know a year or two ago, the center here had one of the authors of this book speaking, which was very, very interesting. The conservatives in Texas hate this book, but a revisionist history of Texas, and particularly slavery in Texas. And it is based, interestingly, on a very detailed academic book by Andrew Torget, a professor at the University of North Texas. And he and his researchers did a detailed dig into statistics about the presence of slavery in Texas. And one thing this slide is about from that book, and he is showing that the population of enslaved people and the population of owners was growing substantially, during the years of the Republic of Texas. From 3,700 enslaved people to 24,000 in the space of just that eight years there. So very interesting. You may have heard the story about Forget the Alamo. That book came out, I think, 3 years ago. And the authors had scheduled a talk at the Texas History Museum in Austin, and they had 300 people. I see some of you are nodding here. They had 300 people confirmed to attend, but at the last minute, their presentation was canceled by some of the politicians not liking the idea. Still a pretty unpopular book in conservative circles in Texas. So Texas was annexed. They wanted, the Anglo-Texans wanted all along to join the U.S., but that really wasn't happening until a little bit later. the President Jackson, President Van Buren were afraid of war with Mexico. So this is what things looked like at that time. During the distance of the Republic of Texas. Of course, that western part was all still Mexico. I need to speed up here a bit, guys. John Tyler was vice president under William Henry Harrison, elected in 1840. Harrison died after only a month in office of pneumonia. So Tyler, who was a Virginian and a slaveholder, became the president. He supported the annexation of Texas. He pushed for a treaty in the Senate in 1843-44, but treaties have to be passed by 2/3 vote, and the Senate voted it down. So he did a bill instead, which in the Congress, which only required a majority vote, and he offered this annexation to Texas. The Republic of Texas accepted, and Texas became a state in the U.S. at the very end of 1845. So the election of 1844, James K. Polk became president, narrowly defeating Henry Clay. He was also very much in favor of annexing Texas. And he was an expansionist generally. He started sending U.S. troops to the Texas border area. This is interesting. You may have heard about this. Donald Trump in the Oval Office. The circled portrait there is Polk. Shortly after Trump was elected, he swapped a picture with the House of Representatives and got the House to loan him this picture of Polk. Apparently his favorite president now. Someone must have educated him about Polk. I'm not sure. So the war starts. I'll go through this quickly. The war didn't last very long. It was April 1846 to September 1847. Final treaty signed in 1848. Let me move on through this. This map really shows a lot of the military history of all of it. There were two smaller military expeditions moving west through New Mexico in what is now Arizona, going to California, kind of taking over California. There was a naval expedition. You can see they're starting. It came around and went into Monterey and San Diego, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles. But the major military operations were there in Mexico, moving further south, pushing across the border to Zachary Taylor was the first. There you can see where it's Taylor. Then midway through, Polk dispatched a group with Winfield Scott by ship to go down to Veracruz. So this is interesting. If you know something about the American Civil War, you probably recognize most of these names. These people were almost all young officers. Grant and Lee, the most prominent. Most of them West Point graduates. And the Mexican War was kind of a training ground for them. 16 years later, they were major generals, even the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and the American Civil War. So it really was kind of the training ground. There's an interesting book about that, also called The Training Ground. But the Union people there, you can see that's most of the commanders of the Union forces that Lincoln cycled through, but before he finally settled on Grant in 1864. So Zachary Taylor was one of the two main U.S. generals. He was elected president in 1848. Winfield Scott was the other main U.S. general. He also ran for president in 1852, but he lost the last Whig candidate. So anyway, there were many volunteer regiments that were put together. The U.S. Army regulars were a fairly small amount at the beginning of the war, but there were volunteer regiments organized from almost every state in the country at that time, 25 states. The Battle of Buena Vista was probably the crucial battle in the war. A couple of interesting casualties there. John J. Hardin and Henry Clay Jr. were the leaders of two of those volunteer regiments. Hardin, there's some contemporary art about them. Hardin had been a congressman elected from the same district as Abraham Lincoln um, in 1840. Sorry. Um, if Hardin had not, and Hardin was actually probably a more successful politician than Lincoln at that time. Lincoln was the congressman in the same district a couple of terms later. If Hardin, sorry, had survived the war and come home as a hero, he could well have eclipsed Lincoln's career. So just an interesting little sideline there. Um, Clay, the major battles and events, the the first bloodshed was April 25th. Polk had dispatched a lot of the regular army to go down to the border of Mexico with Texas and kind of just hang out um, and kind of make threatening moves. Does this sound kind of familiar about what's going on recently with Venezuela? Maybe you know. Interesting. History repeats itself. But a group of U.S. dragoons sort of crossed over that Nueces River into that kind of no man's land, the contested area, got into a battle with a larger Mexican force. Some of them were killed. This allowed Polk, when he heard this news, to deliver a message to Congress in which he said, American blood has been shed on American soil. Amy Greenberg made a talk some years ago. She said, well, this is just a lie. It really was not the case at all. But U.S. was able to declare war, and the U.S. forces under Taylor started moving further and further south into Mexico and winning most of the battles. In 1847, there was that Battle of Buena Vista. Polk then decided to try a different strategic move, and he dispatched Scott by water down through the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America, sorry, Gulf of Mexico. And Scott gets to Veracruz and invades there with 12,000 ships, landing by boat, laid siege to Veracruz, killed a bunch of civilians in bombarding Veracruz, but then started a steady march west directly toward Mexico City, culminating in the Battle of Chapultepec Castle, you probably heard about in September 1847. Mexico City surrendered, and that was the end of it. Nicholas Trist was Polk's emissary to try to negotiate a treaty. Nicholas Trist was a very interesting guy. He was a grandson of Thomas Jefferson. No, I'm sorry. He was married to a granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson, and he was the chief clerk at this time in the State Department. So Polk sent him down to negotiate with Mexico. Anyway, he shortly after he got there in the fall, late fall of 1847, Polk tried to recall Trist, but Trist kind of ignored Polk and came up with a treaty which he sent to Washington to Polk. It's not the treaty that Polk wanted, but Polk decided he'd better just go ahead and do it because maybe the best thing is going to be able to get. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, ratified both in the U.S. and Mexico, and then the last troops left Mexico in the middle of 1848. So one little sideline, you might have heard of the San Patricios. They were an Irish American and some German volunteers who were in one of these volunteer regiments. Particularly the Irish did not like the constraints that they were under from their commanders, who disrespected their Catholic religion. So many of them deserted and joined the Mexican side. For a little while, they were in a battle. A bunch of them got captured, and a bunch of them got executed. Executed on actually the same day that the final battle occurred in Mexico City with the U.S. taking Chapultepec Castle. But anyway, this is, if you've been to Mexico City, you're probably very familiar with this view of the cathedral and the governmental palace in the far side there. And this is like the day after the final battle of Chapultepec, and this is Scott and his entourage entering the Zocalo. You can see in the distance there above the castle is a U.S. flag, and the Mexicans really did not like that. That they felt that that was an excess, and it looks like the U.S. wanted to take over everything. And we'll talk about that in a second. War deaths compared to the U.S. Civil War is not a huge amount of deaths. Note that only 1,700 were in battle, 11,000 disease and other problems like that. So the aftermath, the treaty was really not what Polk wanted. And again, I talked about Nicholas Trist, but Mexico in the end ended up losing the different estimates. I often at least have 53% of Mexico's territory was lost. Um, um, all Mexico movement. There was I will talk a little bit more about that. There was a pretty strong uh, element in among a lot of people in the United States in 1847 to just annex all of Mexico, take it all. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, Congressman Lincoln, who had been elected in 1846, he introduced these resolutions in late 1847, asking Polk, where is the exact spot where American blood was shed? And he really kind of hurt his budding political career by this, and this kind of followed him the rest of his career until he was elected president, that he was being unpatriotic. So here's what we ended up with. That yellow portion there at the bottom of New Mexico and Arizona, that's a portion that the U.S. Purchased from Mexico in 1853, particularly to account for the rail line. But you can see the lower portion there, that's what Mexico became. And just a few years earlier, all of Texas and all of Mexico, California, Colorado, Utah, et cetera, that had all been Mexico, and it had once been Spain. So you can see the huge amount that that Mexico lost. So this is a Grant. I've got too much information here about Grant, but an interview he had with a journalist toward the end of his life, I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States. And that's where, where Amy Greenberg got the title of her book, A Wicked War. Pretty interesting. The wickedness is in the context of our government in declaring war. He says, Texas had no claim beyond the Nueces River. It would push onto the Rio Grande and cross it. So pretty interesting thing. He I have a long quotes here. I won't read all this to you, but you may know that Grant at the very end of his life was he was dying of throat cancer from having smoked dozens of cigars every day for most of his adult life, probably starting as a teenager. But he wrote these memoirs right before he died, and he describes how the Texas settlers, bringing slavery into the state, Mexico from the start, and then they wanted to secede, which they did. Anyway, he goes on here. I won't get all into that. Anyway, the All Mexico movement, very interesting. These are some quotes from newspapers in New York, not in Mississippi. But look at the racial attitudes here. The Mexican race must amalgamate and be lost in the superior vigor of the Anglo-Saxon race, or they must utterly perish. Wow. And then in the New York Globe, and again, this was particularly in 1847. Polk's cabinet, Polk's cabinet was very interested in just let's take all of it, and this New York paper saying there's a spirit abroad to destroy the nationality of that besotted people, the Mexicans. They're going to have to give up, or they brought upon themselves the vengeance of the Almighty. and we ourselves have been raised up to overthrow and utterly destroy them as a separate and distinct nation. So this really could have happened. Polk wanted to do it, um, but it kind of faded away because of racial attitudes. Um, one belief was that non-white Mexicans would threaten the white racial integrity. Um, and John C. Calhoun, you're probably familiar with him, was the most fervent supporter in U.S. politics of slavery, and in this period, and he was arguing in the Congress that bringing non-white people into the United States was a bad idea. That he said the United States is a country of the white man. Yeah, you know. Uh, uh, what Polk really had in mind was, if you look at the map of Texas, look at the U.S., look at the very bottom of Texas, the southernmost part of the United States. Polk had the idea of taking from Mexico, not all of Mexico, but more territory starting at that southern tip of Texas and going straight across to the Pacific Ocean. And that would have taken about another one third of Mexico. So, but when Nicholas Trist sent him this treaty, um, that was not what he got. So he decided to just go ahead and um, agree with what Tristan had developed in his treaty. He, if Polk had a different negotiator and wanted to push harder, he might have actually gotten away with taking a lot more of Mexico, um, that extra third. But Enrique Krauss, you may be familiar with, the Mexican intellectual, he had this op-ed column in the New York Times in 2017, arguing that we really ought to be talking about, both countries ought to be talking about nullifying the treaty and Mexico getting some of its territory back. This, of course, did not happen, not going to happen, but just a very interesting kind of point of view and uh, idea. He talks about a lawsuit. I don't know if that lawsuit ever really happened. This was just kind of a political statement, but um, anyway, there's another book if you're interested in a military history of the war. There's one called "So Far from God," written by John S.D. Eisenhower, who was Dwight Eisenhower's son, the Army veteran. It's a military history. The phrase "so far from God" you may have heard of is something attributed to Porfirio Diaz, and what supposedly it said was he or someone said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States," which is kind of entertaining, but pretty true about poor Mexico. So that is what I have, folks. Thank you for listening, um, and I would be glad to entertain your questions, chat, whatever. Look at the chat questions, or we have just some verbal comments.
I have one. Um,
Hello.
today in Mexico, we have. Yeah, can you hear? Today in
You're a
Mexico,
little
we
bit
have.
a little bit soft, but
Okay. Today in Mexico, we have politicians of the opposition who are actively inviting the United States to create another intervention here.
mm-hmm.
And it makes me curious about the Tejanos at the time who supported the gringos, and whether there was an economic strata involved, as there seems to be now, or simple dependency for livelihood, or some cultural factor.
Sure. No, that's a great question. There certainly were white Tejanos that as you know, in the 1830s, that sided with the Texians. Um, some of those Tejanos were slave owners themselves. Some are actually my ancestors. Um, but Yeah, I don't no, it's a very good question. Some of it was because there was a struggle in Mexican politics over many years between the centralists and the federalists. Um, and most of those in Texas, in some other parts of Mexico, were federalists who wanted more independence from the central government. That was some of the the difficulty. Um, I don't. Yeah, that's a very good question. The Chicano leadership in San Antonio actually welcomed in and helped Stephen F. Austin come in the 1820s, and the other impresarios coming in. Um, so some of it was political, some of it was economic. I think. Good question. But yeah,
Yes, we have a question for our audience, and we'll get the microphone to that individual right away.
sure.
Thank you.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Okay. So just a quick clarification. Would you define your terms of Tejano and Texicans
Sure.
loosely?
Sure. The Tejanos were Mexicans living in Tejas or in Texas. Um, and today, of course, Tejano means people in Texas of Mexican descent. But at that time, um, it meant the Mexican citizens living in Texas, in Tejas, which was Tejas then, not Texas. The Texians, Texian, and I think they came up with that phrase themselves. They were the Anglo immigrants into Texas in the 1820s and 30s. Those were the Texians. And when they became Texans instead, I don't know, but presumably after Texas became a state in the U.S. Yeah.
We have another one. Is that correct?
Hello.
Hello, thank you. I'm interested in your impressions or opinion of Stephen Austin. From what I've read about this period of history, uh, he was negotiating with the Mexican government, trying to, kind of happen in Tejas what the Mexican government wanted to happen, and there were other, quote unquote bad actors, I guess, who just didn't pay any attention to what what Mexico.
Right. Well, as I said, he came there in the early 1820s. Originally, was his father. They actually he was Stephen Apostle was born in Virginia, but he and his father had become an entrepreneur in Missouri, and I'm not sure how he got interested in Texas. Um, but Moses Austin died on the way there. Stephen came on. Stephen also went to Mexico City for a couple of years to help negotiate this. Um, but again, he was in he was the whole process was it was an invitation from the Mexican government, as I was saying, to do this more of this settlement. But I'm not sure if the Austins owned slaves themselves, but they were certainly the promoters of bringing slaves to Texas to, again, practice this cotton agriculture. Um, and driven at that time in the 1820s and 30s by rising demand for cotton from the South, particularly in England. So that was a lot of it. They would grow the cotton and ship it out through New Orleans. Um, right.
Any online or in-house additional questions? Yes, we have another in-house.
What was the driving force behind the taking of people from other parts of the United States to this area? Was there a problem with available land for cotton growing?
Sure.
So it was the need for more or the desire for more land that took them there.
Yes, no, that's an excellent question, and that really was a lot of it. That um, that some of the plantation owners in the South had worn out their land and by overproduction, so needed new land. They also might have um, say several sons. I don't know how many women, unfortunately, were allowed to do this. Might have several sons. A second or third son might be looking for new places to practice this cotton agriculture. Um, and also, there was just a political movement throughout the first half of the 19th century, leading up to Civil War, to be continually expanding the so-called slave power. You know, it just, the background of this, of course, is the conflict between an anti-slavery, a largely anti-slavery North, and a pro-slavery South, where the slave-supported agriculture was being practiced. So there was this constant push, and it also fit within the context of as the United States continuously keeps moving west, forcing the Indians further west and west, and just expanding to these new territories and becoming new states. Are they going to be slave or free? Um, so that was people like Polk and Tyler and other Southern politicians said, well, we want new territory further and further west, but if possible, we want to make it a slave state. So that was a lot of it. But the idea was there were people that wanted to expand their slavery supported cotton production. Hmm.
We have another question here.
Yes, sir.
One moment. Did you have something, sir? Yes.
So kind of as a follow-up to that question, do you know what was the attitude of the Mexican government towards slavery expanding from what was the United States into Mexican territory, given that the
Sure.
Mexican Revolution was based in part on
Oh, yeah.
freeing the slaves?
No, the Mexican government was always pretty much anti-slavery. In fact, they outlawed anti-slavery and they outlawed slavery in 1829, but the Anglos coming in just kind of ignored that. The Mexican government also kind of winked at it because they knew that if they had completely prohibited slavery early in the 1820s, most of the Anglos wouldn't have come, and they wanted Anglos to come and settle. So they at one point they were allowing the Anglos to call their enslaved people indentured servants, but the contracts of indenture were often like for 99 years. So yeah, so it was really kind of the Mexican government was definitely opposed, but they also knew that they couldn't outlaw it completely. So it was, yeah.
And we still have more questions, which is great.
Sure.
Oh, and one waiting online. So here we go. Okay.
Hello.
Thank you. You have mentioned in your presentation the American generals, their training and military fare. How would that compare with what existed at the time in Mexico as far as the leadership and the foot soldiers?
Sure. Well, no, that's a very good question. Sorry, I didn't have time to get into that. The in the war itself, the United States had superior weapons, more up-to-date rifles. They had more money. They didn't necessarily have more troops, but that really helped them win the war relatively easily. A lot of the Mexican troops were very poor kind of draftees, often without shoes or good equipment, certainly not with very good weapons, including cannon. But the I there's an interesting story about the Battle of Chapultepec. You're probably familiar with the Marine Corps hymn from the halls of Montezuma into the shores of Tripoli. Well, when they talk about the halls of Montezuma, it was a small group of Marines who were engaged in that final assault on the Chapultepec castle, where Montezuma, of course, never lived. Um, but most people in the United States could probably now sing that Marine Corps hymn. But there was a Mexican military academy in Chapultepec Castle at that time of teenagers actually training to be Mexican Army officers. And there's a famous story, it's a true story. Six of them, as the battle was about to be finished and they were about to lose, six of these teenage boys jumped to their death from the top of the castle. And there's a great monument now in Mexico City to the Niños Héroes. And one of the boys wrapped himself in the Mexican flag. So interesting. Yeah.
Can I just say something? A couple people on the screen have been waiting. John S. has been waiting for a while with his hand up, and then later Janet. Maybe we could take their questions.
Sure. Let's go with John.
Okay. Hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you articulated many different reasons for the war. But at the end of the day, isn't that just a lot of that just window dressing, motivating the American people so they would go to war? And in other words, is it manifest destiny like 2/3 or 3/4 of the reason that we went to
Sure.
war?
Oh, sure. That's a separate course that I taught about manifest destiny, of course, which the U.S. Mexican War is a major part. But of course, yeah, manifest destiny, you probably know, was the 19th century idea that the U.S. was ordained by God to spread it all the way across the Pacific, starting really when the first European settlers came to New England. It was a constant push of the native peoples across the country moving further and further west. And then Mexico also just kind of became in the way, got in the way, and became another goal. Sure. No, absolutely. Definitely part of Manifest Destiny. Yeah. Amy Greenberg from Penn State has another really good book that is a reader of documents in Manifest Destiny. All kinds of things. And I would just add, most people in the United States don't know we got half of Mexico. In late in the 19th century, we, in my view, stole all of Hawaii. Probably don't know how U.S. acquired Hawaii. Hawaii was a separate, independent country, as a Republican monarchy with a legislature, and the white missionaries and sugar growers, just kind of took it over and forced the queen to abdicate. So, different story. So. Hello. Yes. Hi.
Karen?
Me?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this. I've been wanting to know more about this for a long time. I can't help but see the similarities between this and what's happening in Gaza. But anyway, I know this is focused on Texas, but I'm from California, originally from New York. And I believe you showed that California was ceded to the U.S. by Mexico. I can't remember what date. Was that before or after I think it was before. Right?
Sure.
But since I've been in California more than 35 years now, most of what I've learned about here has been about the Spanish colonial project,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
Spanish missionaries'
Sure.
effect on the indigenous people. There are a lot of Mexicans here. I mean, part of
Definitely.
it was
Sure.
part of Mexico.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about that, especially
Sure.
Spanish influence in
Sure.
Mexico before, or
Sure.
anyway?
Well, no, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear enough. California was part of Mexico. There were actually two Mexican, I guess, Spanish provinces at that time. Also, California was Upper California, was the state of California today. Baja California is of course still part of Mexico, but um, California was part of that territory that was also the became part of the U.S. at the end of the Mexican War in the treaty signed in early 1848. California and again there were those two smaller U.S. Army forces that were moving west. The northern one first capturing Santa Fe into Mexico, but then going on to California, and they then, without much of a battles, kind of just took over California. So California um, and these other areas in between that became, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, parts of some other states. All of that was Mexico, and then became, possession of the U.S. When that treaty was signed in 1848. And California pretty quickly became a state. And at the same time, interesting, there's a book written by a college classmate of mine is pointing out that the discovery of gold in California and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexico ceded all its territory, took place about 2 weeks apart in early 1848. And there's also a long history of the Indian people, the indigenous people in California being suppressed and even murdered in the 1850s and 60s after California became a state. It's a pretty ugly history. There's one scholar who even calls it a genocide in California against the Indians. So the seizure of California or loss of California to Mexico was happening at the same time. So
The Spanish missionaries and
right, yeah, the Spanish missions were there, of course, and I'm not sure when they were starting. I think they were 18th century also, and of course they were to some extent in oppressing a lot of the tribal people. A lot of the indigenous tribes in California were much smaller, and they still exist in that kind of form today. And many of them, of course, are obliterated, but yeah, but it was all the same. But again, there were those two military expeditions moving west, and then the U.S. Navy coming up from the south in the Pacific. But anyway, California was all part of it, and sooner at the same time. So yeah, okay.
All right. Are we, everybody satiated on their curiosity? Of course, you can read all these great books. It's always a great window into the present day. Uh, that being said, I thank you, Joe, and it was fascinating. I look forward to meeting you here sometime and we'll see you again. And others, please check our website, globaljusticecenter.org, to keep up with things we're doing past, present, and future. So thanks and have a great day. Thanks again, Joe.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye. Bye-bye.